This is Liminal Radio. Jason Halsey coming to you live from Hope. This is dead air. I got thrown off by the echo of my past self. Once again, getting accustomed to the technology. I was also trying to find out which song that was playing in the intro, because it didn't come up automatically as it usually does in the chat section at my Mixlr homepage. But I couldn't find out, so it'll have to remain a mystery. One of many. So today's presentation is titled The Ghost of Peter Sellers. The artwork is from the film Hoffman, a film made in 1969, released in 1970, which is a film that I'd never heard of until I was reading Roger Lewis's biography on Peter Sellers, which I've been referring to since I started doing this liminal radio, because I was reading it and it kept sparking thoughts and associations for me. And as I've been going deeper into it, I'm seeing more and more things to talk about. Specifically, the turning point was watching this movie Hoffman. So I guess that's what I'm going to spend today talking about. Hopefully I'll be able to put it in a larger context, which makes it more or less irrelevant whether or not you've seen the film, whether or not you care to see it, and whether even you're interested in Peter Sellers. I wasn't particularly interested in Peter Sellers until I read this biography. It was just another celebrity and another performer, and not one that I had particular fondness for. Although I do remember watching Pink Panther movies as an adolescent in my bedroom, eating tomato soup and cheese rolls that my mother brought me. Well, I guess that was just one particular incident. I don't suppose it was every time I watched a Pink Panther movie, but anyway, I do have that memory. Last week I was talking about joining the collective and my resistance to that, and the context, part of the context was technology and being absorbed and assimilated into and by the technology, and the other context was the opposite, the positive side to this, which is a more organic integration into community, living community of souls, of human beings, around the organic farming project work party that I participated in on Sunday, which went very well. I ended up shoveling horse shit and then goat shit in order to create a vegetable garden bed. There was also sheep's wool was part of the alchemical mix there, which was Joe's recipe for a very fertile planting bed. Anyway, and we together we got the first row ready for sowing, and it was a very satisfying work and quite bonding, and experience I had by the end was of being part of something that was very enriching and very nurturing and very loving. And this was separate from the vegetable garden. I mean, this is the human garden that I was aware of being more planted in as a result of that experience. So that was just a brief summary for those who are interested and curious about how that thing played out. It played out very well, but I mention it today specifically because of the context of what I want to talk about in terms of Peter Sellers, The Hungry Ghost, and Hoffman, that there's a correlation, I think, between this very deep, maybe even meta subject of who we are and where we belong in the collective, or how we can find ourselves by finding our place within the collective of humanity, and the thing I hit upon at the end of last week's broadcast about Peter Sellers, which was very much a free associative ramble, as I want to, about him being this ghost who was lost in the bardo realms of his own imagination, which were represented by the movies that he left behind as a kind of literal crystallization or coagulation, like souls trapped in celluloid, of the different alters that Sellers created, the different dissociated surrogate realities that he created in order to embody those roles, but then of course left the evidence of them in the movies themselves. And I think that's quite an interesting way to look at cinema in general. And what I ended up saying last week at the end was that, maybe part of my immersion in Peter Sellers' psyche via reading this biography and watching some of the movies was a way to rescue that lost soul wandering through the relative infinity of endlessly repeating celluloid loop bardo realms of his own dissociative imagination, fueled by the collective consciousness of humanity, which is, which made a celebrity out of Sellers, the fan base, the audience cult. So we're all in it together, you could say. And now I think that this may be somewhat fanciful. I don't necessarily believe I'm on some shamanic soul rescue mission for Peter Sellers, although I did end up feeling that about Sam Peckinpah. So why not? Why wouldn't it extend to Peter Sellers? The only reason really being that I've never felt an affinity for Peter Sellers, but now I do. And that's what I want to talk about today, how I've discovered this affinity and, why I think it came about. But for now I'm just stitching these two themes together insofar as the experience of finding ourselves through finding our place in the collective relates to, I think, integration, becoming whole, bringing all the parts of our own psyche into harmony, harmonic relationship, as within, so without, and that can only come about through interaction with psyches outside of ourselves, and that of course includes and even means especially those that we feel antithetical to, antipathetic towards, the opposite of sympathetic towards, developing, discovering sympathy for even the most antithetical characters out there and in here. So then it makes perfect sense that one of the ways we would do this would be through developing relationships with celebrities and their fictional characters, some of which are villainous, some of which are shadow projections of those actors' own psyches. And this is what made Hoffman such a remarkable experience. Now, Hoffman is as I say, a very little known film that Peter Sellers made in 1969. It's not a comedy. It's a very dark psychological film that has a certain lightness to it also. It's a very strange hybrid between the sort of dark, twisted sexual psychodrama like Blue Velvet and a kind of rom-com and a sentimental, Beauty and the Beast, I suppose, would be perhaps the closest analogy, which of course is a Disney movie with its dark side, with the thematic narrative of the shadow confronting the light and being assimilated by it and redeemed by it. It has those qualities too, those sort of fairy tale qualities. And the story of Hoffman is that of a businessman, a corporate boss. We don't know very much about the business that he runs. We don't see any of it. It unfolds as much as a play would, pretty much on one setting, which is the apartment of Hoffman himself, the boss. And he has become obsessed with a secretary that works under him, and he has discovered that the fiancée of the secretary, who also works under him, is embezzling from the company. And so he uses this knowledge to blackmail Miss Smith, the secretary that he's obsessed with, to spend a week alone with him in his apartment. And that's how the film begins, with her arriving at his apartment and coming in and submitting to these terms and conditions in order to save her marriage. And of course it's very clear what Hoffman wants from her, and he's very explicit about it in the very first couple of scenes. He says to her, and I'm quoting from the script here, "I do have full use, Miss Smith. Any man suffering massive sexual frustration would be out of his mind if, on getting the girl of his dreams, he didn't put her to full use." And the film proceeds in that spirit. It's a very sinister scenario, and it doesn't take us very long to figure out the nature of the deal that's been cut between them. Initially it's very puzzling, like what she's doing there. It's obvious what his intentions are. He's this lewd, lascivious, sexually obsessed older man, and he's got her now in his grasp, but it's not clear why she would put herself so willingly therein, but that gradually is revealed. And the film is a mixture between a male fantasy and a male nightmare. It's not, the biggest weakness about the film is that it's only half a great work. It is half a great work, but it's missing the female half. The female character isn't well drawn, isn't well written, isn't well acted either by Sinead Cusack, and as a result of that, it doesn't develop in the way that it needs to really attain some kind of deeper resonance. But the character of Hoffman, as played by Peter Sellers, as I say, is this very uneasy mix between male fantasy and male nightmare, like the worst possible view of masculinity, and the two are inseparable. And I myself wrote a script called Grasshopper. I think I later changed the title to The Finders, about a man called Jeffrey who suffers from such extreme OCD that he has to live every day in exactly the same way, and he does exactly the same things at exactly the same time every day. And one of the things he does is that he keeps a girl in his basement who he abducted as a child, and he has raised her to be nothing more than his sex object, a kind of organic robot or sex doll that he's able to have sex with exactly and precisely on schedule as he wants to. Of course, that would be tricky as far as his schedule, because he might not always want it at the same time. I didn't explore that in the script, actually. But anyway, it's something I have explored myself in terms of the dark side of male fantasy, male dominance, and the desire to have complete control over the object of desire, and that's very much what Hoffman is about. It's a very unusual movie. It's clearly written with an intelligent sensibility, and many of the lines are remarkably disturbing, let's say, and Peter Sellers gives line readings that do full justice to them. And I won't sum up the whole story, but it's probably worth mentioning that as the film proceeds, Hoffman becomes less and less of a predator and more of a sad and tragic character who is desperately trying to win the object of desire's love. Rather than using the advantage that he has over her in the way that he is claiming to use it. Like his first warning to her is that of course he's going to make full use of this object of his desire. He'd be mad not to, but in fact that's the very thing he doesn't do. He actually spends the time trying to win her love, trying to dissolve her defenses, her disgust and contempt for him. An interesting scenario, because he sets up the conditions, the necessary conditions for him to have time with the object of his desire, but they're also the conditions that ensure that she have absolute contempt for him and fear of him. And so then his goal becomes to neutralize the second effect in order to maximize the first. In other words, in order to fully take advantage of the circumstances, he has to neutralize the character of them that is controlling and that is frightening and threatening to Miss Smith. He has to show her that he's really not the kind of person that would ensnare her this way if he didn't have to. He's actually a gentleman and a knight who simply wants to love her as she deserves to be loved. Now, of course, this is equally delusional, but it makes his psychopathology much more nuanced, profound, and disturbing, because he becomes increasingly sympathetic and even attractive, not just to us, but to the Miss Smith character, who ends up wooed to the point that she actually makes herself available to him. She fulfills his fantasy, which is to wake up with the naked object of desire beside him in bed, and then to make full use of that object. And when he awakens to his fantasy fulfilled, he doesn't act upon it. He is, well, it's not clear whether he's afraid or whether he's satisfied enough not to take advantage. Whatever the case, he backs away from the object of desire in the moment that it's made fully available to him, and at that point Miss Smith, the object that was initially fearing him and then desiring him, or at least desiring to be desired by him, turns and becomes angry and hostile. So it's a very precise thematic or dramatic summation of the psychological struggle between male and female. And well, the overall effect of the film, in any event, and why I'm talking about it so much, was that it left me with a very different impression of Peter Sellers. Like, for the first time I felt love for Peter Sellers. I felt an enormous amount of sympathy for the man because of this performance that he had given. And it's a performance, by the by, that he tried to eradicate. After the film was made, he tried to have all copies of it destroyed. He was not able to. And by some strange coincidence, although he wasn't able to destroy the copies, the prints of the film itself was so poorly distributed or advertised that it was effectively suppressed. And so nobody saw it, and to this day almost nobody's heard of it. So there's clearly something going on there that is worth looking more deeply into. What happens when an artist, in this case an actor, digs deep into his own soul and reveals aspects that he himself was not only not willing to have seen, but was not willing to see. And then suddenly the whole world is able to see them, which means he himself can no longer unsee them. What happens at that point? I think it can go one of two ways, and in the case of Peter Sellers, it went the wrong way. And by seeing himself, by letting himself be seen as the ghost that he was, he became even more spooked and retreated still further into ghost-like celluloid fantasy, of himself. This is Liminal Radio. I'm going to play a song now, and then I will come back with some more about Peter Sellers and Hoffman.
Your hand, come walk with me. Let's go look for Christmas trees. Hold out your hand, come walk with me. Let's go look for Christmas trees.
This is Liminal Radio. It's Jason Horsley coming to you live from Hope. This week I'm talking about Peter Sellers in Hoffman. I'm going to give a little bit of backstory now. And this is a testimony from Roger Lewis's book from Peter Sellers' first wife, Anne, who describes a period or encounter with Peter, I think after they'd broken up. Yes, they were separated already. He had 2 children with Anne, and stop the music there. And they'd been to see her mother, and they were returning from her mother. And while they were driving back, this is Anne, I drove, and whilst we were on our way, he kept asking, "Who am I? I don't know who I am." He went into this whole speech about dark green, which he called Levi green, because Ted, Anne's second husband, had used it to decorate his house, and he kept asking who I was, who he was, a whole performance like he'd lost his memory. I drove him from Bovingdon to Hampstead, took him to the flat. He went in, slammed the door, wheeled around on me and said, "Right, you're not getting out. You are not leaving this flat. I will not let you out." It was then 4 o'clock in the morning. I had to phone the doctor. "You've got to come over. He won't let me out. And I want to leave." He came and stayed with Peter and sedated him. It was terrifying. So that was more or less the time that Sellers made Hoffman, the film, thereby echoing some of the themes and even storyline of his life, so to speak. Not that his life had a storyline. And this is Roger Lewis talking about the movie. Sellers' Prince of Darkness doesn't get to release his tensions in any normal or violent way. Instead, he toys with the girl and prolongs his own agony. the film has a sadomasochistic undercurrent. Sellers is sinister not through any cackling, hooting, or exophthalmic virtuosity. He is formal and polite. He is the more scary for being solemn and correct. He is full of silent staring and noiseless snooping and slinking. It is as if his permanently twilight apartment has been purposefully designed as a voyeur's maze. We are never quite sure which door he will come through. Some locks fail to click. Some thresholds seem to materialize in solid walls. Hatches, glass partitions, unexpected corners, and there is Hoffman's leering face to elicit a shudder. Sellers' stillness, the immobility he shared with Alec Guinness and which is deployed as autistic for Chance and gnomic for Fu Manchu, is utilized for this one occasion in his career as a source of fear. And he quotes some of the lines in the film indicate the misogyny of the character and his attitude towards women. Women are always hungry for something. Most girls escape being chopped up only because they can cook. And if a man could eat a girl's soft young body like ice cream, he would not have to struggle to live with her soft young mind. Hoffman's problem isn't a straightforward hatred of women. What he hates most is that part of himself which needs them for sex and other domestic duties, and he hates women the more when they yield. It is the hatred of a man who is dependent on his victims, and yet who wishes to be celibate and aloof. Every girl is a flower garden with a compost heap at the bottom, Mrs. Hoffman, and many a noble man has had to drown his dwarf wife in a zinc bath or strangle an idiot girl on a muddy common in order to draw attention to himself. Slaying women, or at the very least subjecting them, is the male's rite of passage. When a woman is dead, you possess her wholly. She has no independent life left. Sellers' phrasing here is masterful. He pauses, potters about the flat, moves from thought to thought, adds to his idea. It is the key speech in Hoffman, and not incidentally it expresses Sellers' own view of women. It's the moment when the central character realizes that he is disgusted by what he craves. "Lips that touch Kipper's shall never kiss mine," he says riddlingly. To try and cope with the temptation and lust, he reduces women to their component parts. He verbally dismembers them. "You're here to be 2 arms, 2 legs, and the bits that fit in the middle," Miss Smith is informed. She stares with terror into his big, sad eyes. Contempt, fastidious anger, humiliation, sullying and being sullied. The moods and nuances in the work make it less of a film than a confessional, as Sellers knew. It's the first time I've been called on to play what they, the producer, the director, the author, call myself. It's a very difficult role to play. It comes out of a lot of anguish. The writer of the film was somebody called Ernest Gebler, who was a novelist. And he wrote the screenplay, and according to Peter Sellers, Gebler said to Sellers that he wanted me to play myself. I told him it was very difficult because I had no idea what I was really like. As Lewis says about Sellers trying to buy the negative and destroy it, he was confronted by a self-portrait which revealed his internal monstrousness, and like Dorian Gray, he wanted to plunge a dagger through its heart. The director explained, "Benjamin Hoffman is very lonely, very insecure, very self-deprecating, and these were all terms used by people to describe the real Sellers, so there was much of the character already in our actor. The part called for that vacuum factor of his way of filling himself with everybody and yet being nobody. This was not the sort of role that would normally attract him. He usually went for bravura stuff. Hoffman was not that at all. He had to play the internal self, which wasn't there to start with. He couldn't rely on mimicry, and he went through the torture of not knowing who Hoffman was, because he didn't know who he was." Oh, and then there's a line in the film, or a speech in the film, which really stood out to me when I watched it, and he quotes it here also. "My maniac face, Girls all over the world are afraid of men with my expression. Plain, sad-faced men, mature, sexually starved men, in offices, buses and trains, men who've missed the boat. Their day is coming. Their revolution is almost upon you. So that seemed to be the voice of the incel, an early harbinger of the incel revolt. And the film very much encapsulates and brings together a lot of archetypal threads that I've explored, I think, through my life in my writing about film. It's remarkable that it's a film that I had never heard about, because it's very much a film that I think would have preoccupied me or fascinated me even as a young man. Well, certainly as a young man, even as an adolescent, I think I would have been intrigued by it. And yet it wasn't until my 53rd year, I just turned 52, that I discovered this film. And it's curious in various different ways. It's curious for me to even discover a film that kind of reawakens that passionate interest in movies. And at the same time, as I said, it has awakened for the first time a love and affinity and a sympathy and affection and empathy for Peter Sellers. And I feel quite moved now when I talk about him in reference to this movie. I feel as though watching that film has established a connection between my own soul and that of Peter Sellers. Now, that might be putting it a bit fancifully, but on the other hand, I'm not sure how else to put it. It's very mysterious to me. Not only that I would feel such unexpectedly deep love, empathy, and sadness for Peter Sellers, and of course reading the biography, I mean, I can't separate it from that, but I know almost without doubt that if I hadn't seen Hoffman, almost at the end of the biography, I wouldn't have reached this feeling. I wouldn't be experiencing this feeling of deep love for this man. It was the film itself that did it. And it occurred to me early on, when I started to dig up old Peter Sellers movies to do the background research that would help me to enjoy the biography more, to understand better its subject, that watching movies is a kind of necromancy, a kind of seance. We are almost literally, or perhaps literally, but also figuratively, we're summoning the images of the dead into life again. And there's there's nothing lifeless about an actor performing on celluloid when we watch it. They're as completely alive in that moment on the celluloid as they would have been, the next day watching the rushes. The lifelessness is merely in the fact that it's technologically mediated, but it's not reduced by time. No matter how much time has passed, assuming the print is still good, it seems as fresh as ever. They are as present via that medium as ever. And so that just as a general experience is quite eerie and puzzling, that the technology that we take for granted makes something possible that was never possible before now, that perhaps only was possible in a metaphysical sense, as in connecting to the ancestors, connecting to the souls of the dead. And that would only be possible through some kind of deep, felt, embodied, ensouled, and heartful connection through love, I would say. Or perhaps the dark side of love, as Hoffman's character expresses and embodies, obsession. But even that is love, just as Frank Booth was acting out of love for Dorothy. It might be love that's twisted and turned inward and become violent and destructive, but it's still in its raw essence love. So what's going on there? Well, I don't really know. It's somewhere between two extremes one is the trivial and one is the transcendental. The transcendental is, as I say, that the possibility of connecting to other souls even after they're dead and gone, and somehow restoring them to whatever that they've lost and fallen from or been estranged from. Words are failing me there, so I'll skip to the trivial and perhaps come back to that. And the trivial being just the way that I discover an interest and an admiration for an actor for the first time by watching a movie that was unusually profound and resonant for me. Now, of course, that isn't trivial to many of us. I mean, we consider art and culture to be something of profound meaning, but I guess what I'm getting at is why that is so, and that it's only superficially to do with the talent. Now, one of the things that happened with Peter Sellers was that he himself, with this prodigious talent, he seemed to squander it. It was like with Hoffman and Miss Smith, that he found himself despising the thing that he craved after, and despising himself for wanting it and depending on it, while Sellers himself craved recognition and success for his talent, for his gift, but the more that he achieved it, the more he found himself despising it, the more he denigrated his own gifts, and ended up doing an endless series of Inspector Clouseau movies that were increasingly asinine, not to mention countless movies that we've never heard of for good reasons, as opposed to Hoffman, which we've never heard of for the wrong reasons, because he simply couldn't value his own gifts because of his own deep psychological torment, and because the less he valued, the more he abused them, the less he could value them, and so on. And what happened with Hoffman, it seems, was that some part of him was crying out to use his gifts in a way that would actually be meaningful, and to play a role that would allow himself to resolve something in his own psyche by seeing it. I can think of no other reason why he would have done a film of that sort. So he was clearly divided, and yet he did choose to make this film, and it's a consummate performance. It's so far superior to his performance in Being There that I'm tempted to go into a spiel about how inverted our culture is, and how it always rewards us for our bad deeds and punishes us for our good deeds, and how we can see this in the arts in just this way, that when an artist does his best work, he gets reviled for it, like Nick Pizzolatto with True Detective 2, or Ridley Scott with The Counselor, or so on and so forth. And when he does mediocre work, he gets raised up for it. I haven't seen Being There in a long time, but I never really cared for that movie. It seemed like a one-note movie. Didn't seem like it had any kind of depth. Just a sort of a timely joke that coincided with the Ronald Reagan election. The idea that an idiot could pass himself off for a sage. I don't think anyone believed that Ronald Reagan was a sage, but anyway, there's certainly there's some rich potential in that film, but I don't feel that it was really developed, and I've never felt that performance was particularly I didn't feel much poignance or pathos in that performance, and I think that that's to do with how it was the apotheosis or the culmination of Sellers' own attempt to mythologize himself as this, that his emptiness was a kind of saintliness. I'm not sure, but I think it might have been his idea to have Chance walk on water at the end. I know that he approved it. And even with the outtakes playing over the end credits, which breaks the spell of the illusion in the movie, that would seem to be designed to strengthen the idea that Chance is Peter Sellers, that they're one and the same. At the very least, to remind audiences of the man behind the character Chance Gardner, and to love him all the more for that. And the sort of wheels within wheels are an infinity loop here, because Peter Sellers was himself, had this empty hole at the core of him, this lack of central coherence due to, well, a whole cluster, no doubt, of formative experiences centering around his mother, his domineering mother, and his weak and ineffective father. Classic universal stuff, template there for weak central coherence. And this is what made him a sponge. This is what made him a kind of cipher that was able to take on these other characters and embody them, be possessed by them, which itself is very akin to ancestral possession. He became a vehicle for hungry ghosts, and he turned those hungry ghosts, allowed those hungry ghosts to use him, because in return he got to be the wizard who could embody characters so completely that he disappeared into the roles. Now, that reached its apotheosis with Chance and being there, because the character Chance, he himself has no central coherence, he has no core personality, he's a void, he's a cipher onto which the world projects their own illusions, their own desires, and thereby he becomes a saintly figure rather than simply an idiot. And with Hoffman, what Sellers was doing, perhaps the only time in his career, fully anyway, was rather than filling the void with fantasies or with hungry ghosts that he could cartoonize and mythologize and turn into comic characters that were romantic heroes one way or another, and thereby never having to really look at the constitution of that void within him, the hungry pathology of it, he avoided the truth. But with Hoffman, he was willing, as I say, on this one occasion only, to let the hungry void itself express itself, to embody the hungry ghost, not in some fairy glamour magic way, that the way that the ghost wanted it to be seen in order to continue to feed, like the vampire that uses hypnosis to seduce his victims, but in the Dorian Gray sense of its true configuration. He let his true face be seen. Now, of course, again, there's an ironic paradox, because that true face was itself the face of the false identity, the false of the possessing ancestral ghosts that were passed on to him by his mother, and so on. And so it potentially goes round and round endlessly without a resolution. The resolution hasn't happened for Peter Sellers, it seems to me. And part of the evidence of that is that the one movie in which he let himself be seen has not been seen. So I think that was why I felt such a profound impact from it, because I think that movie was his cry for help, and nobody heard it. And I heard it. And it was very shrill and desperate and overwhelmingly sad.
Well, I never intended to set it all off with some dynamite stuck to my face. Well, you shouldn't eat anything straight from the trough, like you shouldn't drink straight from the vase. Now the weather out here is unfit for a beast, till I search for a beast for a mate. My engine won't run if it don't have the grease, which I drink by the dam, by the crate. And the man with no hands at the are drinking their grenadine shine while the farmers are down shifting coal. She went out the door and she left me behind while her python remained on patrol. Now don't try to tell me that I look underfed and you'll treat me to dinner for 3. No thanks for the offer, I'm staying in bed, just myself and my tapeworm and me. And the man with no hands at the meat cutter's dance is the one who's really in charge of the food and the booze and the pairs of short pants you can have when we're out on the barge. Now the dazzling drunkards who drink in this place will strangle you just for your change, to pay for their outfits of rhinestones and lace which they wear when they're riding the range. Now how can a man ride the back of a horse when he can't hit the front of a whale? The answer is found as a matter of course once you suck all the wind from the sails. And the man with no hands at the meat cutter's dance is the one who's really in charge of the food and the booze and the pairs of short pants you can have when we're out on the barge. Yes, the man with no hands at the meat cutter's dance is the one who's really in charge of the food and the booze and the pairs of short pants you can have when we're out on the barge.
Sorry about the dead air there, mic was down. This is Jason Horsley for Liminal Radio, talking about Peter Sellers' celluloid cry for help. On a practical note, as I mentioned in the chat section, Hoffman is not easy to see. I found a way to download it online. Don't want to say too much to compromise myself. Let's say that it's not considered the legitimate way of seeing such a film, but it may be the only way for you to do so unless you want to buy a DVD at Amazon, etc. I do think it's worth it, either one, splashing out a few bucks or breaking cyber laws. No, I'm not endorsing that. But anyway, that's just on a practical note. On the more abstract note, I think that one of the things that makes this so rich for me as a vein to mine is that it's a continuation of almost a coagulation of a real lived experiential example of the complicity that we have as consumers of culture with the crimes of culture, with the abuses, with the suffering and anguish and torment that goes into the creation of culture. And that just as, say, if we buy products from a sweatshop, we're completely ignorant, if we are completely ignorant of the conditions that those products were made, and we're just concerned about getting a good deal, we do become complicit there with exploitative systems. But I think an even better and more pertinent analogy would be if we imbibe fish that was swimming downriver from Fukushima, we're going to get polluted, we're going to end up radioactive. And so we probably do want to know as much as we can about the configuration of what we're consuming and the conditions into which, under which it was created. And so the whole Peter Sellers thing is a lived example of that. And of course this also intersects with my ongoing quest to uncover the truth about Hollywood and the organized malevolence that it seems to be embedded in and even to be an organ of thereof. And in the case of Peter Sellers, well, there's nothing in this book implying that he was complicit with any kind of organized malevolence, but the whole book is very much a exploration of his own individual malevolence, and not as a hatchet job or a takedown. The biographer, Roger Lewis, clearly loves his subject and is very sympathetic towards him, but he also doesn't pull any punches or minces words. And here's an example of that. What I think we need to do with Sellers is revert to more ancient terminology when summing him up. He had an evil streak in him. Sellers was evil. At the end of the last chapter, when I was in the graveyard, I promised you a further concluding point, and this is it. He was a destroyer. He was pandemonium. I don't mean that he was a black and white horror movie ghoul liable to jump out from the shadows at any moment. Neither was he involved with devil worship cults or similar supernatural lunacies, or at least not all of the time. The meaning of Sellers came to me only recently when I was reading about Henry James's remarkable family. His father, William, once had a famous apprehension of evil. To all appearances it was a perfectly insane and abject terror, without ostensible cause, and only to be accounted for, to my perplexed imagination, by some damned shape squatting invisible to me within the precincts of the room, and raying out from his fetid personality influences fatal to life. The Jameses acknowledged evil, portentous evil, the hot breath of the pit, and wrote about it. Sellers yielded to it. He embodied it. There was a darkness wheeling about him. This is the strong impression I am left with after spending 25,000 hours in his company, and I don't believe my intuitions can totally be discounted as those of an author who, approaching the end of a long and difficult task, starts to resent his subject for consuming so much of his life, though there must be a bit of that abroad too. I had something else to read, but I didn't mark it, so now I'm not sure where it is. I'm particularly aware, now that I've moved to liminal radio, about not having dead air. It's funny, it's quite inhibiting actually, and I don't know if it's really that necessary, but I guess I'll get to that a bit later. Maybe I'll find it in the musical break. So I wonder how many biographies have outright stated that their subject was evil, unless they are biographies of world dictators, Adolf Hitler anyway, where it's almost de rigueur, but also perhaps redundant. In the case of Hitler, it's agreed upon. But in terms of celebrity biographies, I would guess that this is probably the only one out there. I also think it's probably the best celebrity biography I've ever read. And one of the things that makes it great is that it meanders in a way that's quite coherent. That's more coherent than a linear narrative. One of the things about biographies that tends to make them rather dull is that they stick to a chronology and they just work their way through childhood, schooling years, education, working their way up the entertainment industry, become discovery, breakthroughs, becoming famous, and then film by film, and so on. And this gives a sort of grinding mechanical quality to a life which hopefully it doesn't have, or at least even if it does, we want to see past that grinding mechanism that a person's life has become to the soul that is trying to express and embody in that life. And I don't think there's anything else that's going on in any life besides that, the soul that is trying to embody and express. I mean, the other thing that would be going on, of course, would be all the attempts of the constructed identity of the traumatized ego to prevent that from happening, but that would merely be a reaction to the primary factor, the primary element. So in his biography, Lewis is attempting to find the soul of his subject, and as a result his subject becomes about how Peter Sellers was attempting to find his own soul, or, as I say, the dark side of that was attempting to suppress, to disconnect from, to disown, even to destroy his own soul. And this he did through many myriad means, including and perhaps especially through his wives and his children, his abusive behaviours, which I haven't got into. And they are listed, but again, not in a dull and dreary chronological fashion, but in this very organic way. It's as though this is something that I found with Seen and Not Seen, where of course the subject was myself. It's as though Lewis, in writing the biography, has to keep approaching the terrible gnawing wound at the core of Peter Sellers from different angles, and then withdraw, and then dissociate and change the subject and take his attention somewhere else, and then approach it again from a different angle a bit later, and then the same again, back away, having seen a little bit more, so that he's incrementally allowing himself to see the truth about Sellers in a way perhaps that Sellers wasn't able to allow himself to see it, certainly wasn't able to. And of course the way that most readers are not going to be willing or able to see, because if you're reading a biography about Peter Sellers, it's presumably because you like Peter Sellers and you admire him as an actor, and you don't necessarily want to have your capacity to enjoy Peter Sellers' performances removed or destroyed by the truth. But I think that is going to be an inevitable effect of it, essentially. How easy is this? How possible is it to laugh at Inspector Clouseau prancing around if every contortion reminds you of one or another atrocity or abuse or anguish in the life of the real flesh and blood person who's really just using these roles to dissemble and escape the terrible reality that he's oppressed by. It definitely makes the whole experience rather compromised. And of course, ironically, what is less entertaining, precisely because it's getting closer to the raw truth of it and the underlying trauma, is so much more nourishing, rich and meaningful, and so much more satisfying. I enjoyed Hoffman infinitely more, and that's not a word I use if I can avoid it, but in this case I'd say it's accurate, infinitely more than I would have enjoyed rewatching any of the Pink Panther movies, because I wouldn't have enjoyed that at all. It would have been painful and unpleasant, so I didn't do it. And not because of my sympathy for Sellers, but just because those films are so empty and shrill, and I know that that's how I'd find them to be, even though there might be a laugh here and there. It would be a laugh that would stick in my throat. Watching Hoffman, on the other hand, was a revelation. It felt as though something that had been suppressed and pushed out of awareness for so long was finally coming into awareness. And of course, again, at a trivial level, all that was me recognizing an aspect to Sellers that I hadn't yet seen, an ability to play a dramatic role with real poignance and depth and sincerity. And what's interesting, and one of the things, many things that's interesting about Hoffman, the role, is that he does manage to make it amusing. It is, as well as being a complete departure from his other roles, it's also familiar. It also contains some of the familiar mannerisms and touches of Peter Sellers. So we're aware that we're not just watching Peter Sellers the actor, but we're also to some extent watching Peter Sellers the persona and Peter Sellers the character that he created through his movies, which, although they were all quite different in the specifics, in a general sense they had an underlying similarity to them. I might be hard-pressed to describe that similarity, because this is all relatively new to me. I suppose one of the elements, the first one that's coming to mind, is the puer-aeternus, the kind of little boy, the goofy little boy who's also the little boy lost quality. The attempt to ingratiate and to appease and to be charming, combined with a sort of scathing, cynical misanthropy. I'm not sure if that's true of Clouseau. Clouseau is definitely the innocent, but he's also, of course, a destructive force. Like everywhere he goes, he causes destruction. So this very volatile combination is present throughout his work, but generally it's used for comic effect, and in Hoffman it's used for tragic effect. And now I'm remembering a line I read yesterday, and I can't remember what it was, but it was, "Is my life a tragedy or a comedy? I prefer to think of it as a comedy." It was something like that, and I can't remember who said that or where I read that. It's quite strange, because it sounds like something Peter Sellers might have said, although I don't think he could have possibly tried to fool himself about that his life was anything but a tragedy. And this was even played out in very mundane terms in his life, was that everywhere Peter Sellers went, people wanted him to be funny, and yet he wasn't a funny person when he was himself. He was dour, sombre, miserable, depressed, unhappy, angry, hostile, misanthropic, contemptuous, etc., etc. He would go to public occasions because he liked to be seen, he liked to be admired. But the problem there, it created a bit of a conundrum for him. The problem there was that the people who would come up to him because he was famous and want to get close to him would then expect him to make them laugh. And he wasn't able to do this. The only way he was able to do this was to actually go into character and become somebody else, to disassociate, to go into an alter. So I think, Peter Sellers is probably an outstanding example of the correlation between trauma fragmentation and dissociation and the creation of alters and pathology and all of this with an effective celebrity talent, and how that efficacy is attained and maintained, and the price of it, without having any need to postulate MK Ultra organized trauma-based mind control programs or anything of that kind, without ruling them out also. But there's no reason to rule them out, because there's no reason to really mention them, except it's another context, it's another deep background. Which came first? I would say that what came first was the coping mechanisms that we develop as children in the face of parental neglect and abuse, trauma and pain, become our charismatic gifts as adults. And so the more profoundly impacted we are as children negatively, the more prodigious our coping mechanisms need to be, the more charismatic talent we develop. The more likely, unless we're so damaged that we can't function well enough, the more likely we are to become cultural icons who inspire others with their prodigious gifts of fantasy creation. Now, this isn't particularly new, I keep coming back to this, but what's new is getting to the very personal meat and potatoes of it. Because as I say, with Peter Sellers, it doesn't matter, although it would be interesting, whether any of this was orchestrated intentionally and deliberately via programs of trauma-based mind control or anything of that kind, because the result is the same. The product is the same. I just lost my thread there. Oh, I know what it was. It was evil. So when Roger Lewis writes about Peter Sellers being evil, it provides an opportunity for grounding evil in the mundane and in the human realm. The idea that Peter Sellers might be evil, on the one hand, could take us into satanic cults and organized ritual abuse and MK Ultra mind control, because that's what we think of as evil. Or it could take us the other way, and it's not either or, into the realization that evil is something that is in all of us, that's put in all of us through the culture and through trauma, and that it's inseparable from things that we consider good. Charisma, talent, success, ambition, brilliance. But that it's really not just a source of suffering, but a symptom of suffering. A symptom of suffering so great that the person who is subject to it will do anything at all not to experience it, to find a way out of it, anything at all. And will of course have to find rationales and justification for those behaviours, which will be correspondingly abusive to others, particularly if he's foolish enough to marry and to have children. Just going to answer a couple of comments there. One is about how the songs, almost every song I've been playing is in a minor key. Is this deliberate? Well, as I talked about last week, none of the song selections are deliberate, and nor is the playlist deliberately made up of minor keys. I don't even know the difference between a major and a minor key, even though I can play guitar a little bit. I am musically illiterate, so no, that would have some other unknown cause behind it. So yeah, if you want to speculate what that might be, feel free to, but I have no idea what that might be, what that might refer to. The question of evil. Evil is something that is in all of us, that is put into all of us through culture, through trauma. Are you saying that cultures are inherently traumatic? Well, I'm saying that ours is. I can't refer to other cultures because I haven't been born into them. I think that there's a symbiosis between trauma and culture, or how cultures form. So I think trauma is an etiological factor within the creation of cultures. Whether it always has to be, or to what degree, is perhaps the question, as in the more extreme the traumas that are generating the culture, the more traumatic the culture is. Certainly, the comment says, Paul, British culture is, certainly US culture such as it is, and has been having a traumatic effect on many. So I found the passage that I was looking for, and I'll read the whole paragraph. This is on page 732 of The Life and Death of Peter Sellers. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, though I'm not convinced of that either. I guess that maybe is a full quote. I mean, he's not putting it in quotes, but I know it's a famous saying. The first part, evil that men do lives after them. I'm not sure if the second part is part of the famous quote or not. After he had made the Magic Christian and had given lots of press interviews to peddle the money can't buy happiness, everybody has their price theme, Sellers, steeped in decay and gloat, evangelized as follows. Love, in the fullest sense of the word, contributes to my search for happiness. Not just physical love, I mean just love for people from one person to another. Getting yourself together to get into that position, trying not to be uptight about people. You know when somebody says something that makes you rile a bit, trying to kill that if you can. I've been unsuccessful at this, but that would be my aim. That would be my aim, except. Note that use of the conditional tense. In fact, Sellers had long before renounced love in order to gain power. That, I now see, has been the theme of my book. It is what gives Sellers' story a moral dimension. Then he quotes somebody saying about Sellers and his behaviour. He says, inasmuch as you are interested in the psychopathology of artists, you might also cast an eye at their spouses. The last Mrs. Sellers, now Mrs. Unger, was swept off her feet at a very early age by someone who was both used to getting his way in everything and very aware of his mortality and fragility. She has had a rotten time of it for the past 10 years, and all that wealth has given her no satisfaction. Her health is poor and her spirits are low, but I have intimations that she is beginning at last to take charge of her life. At least I hope so. I think that one of the qualifications of artists should be a vow of celibacy. They should be confined to ruining only their own lives. That ties in with the incel thing, involuntary celibate, saying that artists should be voluntary celibates. When Sellers talks about love there, I thought it was interesting as an example of hypocrisy. Clearly isn't strong enough a word, of the delusional nature of not just celebrities, but of course celebrities are like ourselves, reified and magnified and exaggerated, raised up to the world stage by the observer effect, to receive the projections of the collective and thereby be enlarged by them in a literal sense with the movie screen, but in all the many other senses that are more figurative. And so the corresponding pathology, or the pathology that corresponds with a desire for celebrities in the first place, is exaggerated and magnified in the celebrity, him or herself. Now, what is that? It's a desire for an identity. It's a desire for meaning projected outward. It's, of course, desire for a benevolent parent that one never had, in the most basic sense, biologically speaking, and even a desire for gods, to connect to the gods, to our higher nature, to our angels of our better nature. And anyway, so what Peter Sellers is doing there is he's paying lip service to love in a way that sounds sufficiently superficially sincere for me at least to think that he might have believed it at some level, because he had to believe it. He had to believe that he himself believed that love was the most important thing, and that he knew this, and that he would orientate himself towards that knowing, and therefore towards love. He would, if he could, but he couldn't. Again, we have the cry for help. It sounds like hypocrisy dissembling, and the sheep's clothing for the wolf. Peter Sellers was abusing his wives, he was abusing his children, I don't know physically or sexually, but psychologically he was certainly abusing them. And he was abusing more or less anyone that he could get close enough to abuse, including the people he worked with. He was a monomaniac, he was schizophrenic, psychopath, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of different labels we could put on him, but none of them include the word loving. And yet, part of him knew the truth, that without love he was nothing. So we've got this uneasy alliance between the dissembling, the hypocrisy, the lies, the deception, the glamour magic of the sociopathic predator, with the cry for help of the same. So when Sellers is talking about love, it's as if he's begging to be called out on it, as if he's begging to be seen for the lying hypocrite that he is, and thereby be called to account. And I mean, it has been said, and it's been said about Hitler again, but I imagine others too, that evil characters are usually sentimental. And even, I mean, we tend to think that this is just a mask that they wear. This is when presidents pretend to be born-again Christians and so on, and kiss babies. And to some extent it is, but I think it's the mask that is truly effective is just as the delusion that truly works is the one that the person who is assuming it can fully believe in and identify with. And this is where fragmentation and altars come in. Anyway, those are my thoughts about when evil pays lip service to love. It's because evil is an expression of the suffering that comes from an incapacity to love. So, of course, what evil is going to express in its every abuse is the suffering of its incapacity to love. Is its incapacity to love, is love. It's going to be crying out for love in all of the worst ways, including the horribly insincere and shallow and whatever is a better word than hypocritical. I mean, you can imagine what it would be like to be Sellers' ex-wives or his children reading or hearing or watching Peter Sellers talking about love and how important it was to him, how enraging that would be, and how agonizing to know that he could fool millions of people into thinking that he was this wonderful person who was living for love because they loved him and they'd want to believe it, while at the same time he had only contempt for them, the ones closest to him. But take it one step further. Imagine what that would feel like if you were that person yourself, who wanted so badly to be seen as loving, but was unable to communicate love to the people most important to you. That would be hell. That would be hell. No, somebody has typed that and attributed it to me. Evil is an expression of the suffering that comes from an incapacity to love. Well, and put my name on it. Well, I suppose, literally speaking, that is me because I've adapted Dostoevsky. But Dostoevsky is hell is the suffering that comes from an incapacity to love. So it's really a paraphrase rather than the original. Anyway, just to correct any illusions people might have about my charismatic brilliance. I don't have it. Well, I suppose I do have it because I've been traumatized, but I mean, I don't want it and I don't need it. I'm just trying to find and be myself. That's the only goal here. And, well, once again, I found myself wandering down shadowy passages and into thorny forests full of goblins and witches on that quest for self-knowledge, self-awareness. I found myself lost in a nightmarish celluloid bardo realm created by and for Peter Sellers. But I hope with some ray or chink of light, I certainly feel much more optimistic about Peter Sellers' general fate, the eternal soul of Peter Sellers and its fate, having seen Hoffman and having discovered the truth about him, than I did when I just associated him with Inspector Clouseau and just thought of him as one more Hollywood puppet. Now that I've got closer to the quick of who he was, it feels as though that's actually a much more optimistic outlook, even though it's much, much darker. And I think that's all maybe any of us want. Not for us to all be happy and cheerful with each other, but for us to feel trusting and respectful and safe and secure enough to communicate our desperation honestly without trying to tear each other down. That's actually a very hard place to get to, where we can let our desperation show in a way that isn't desperate. Anyway, that's perhaps a closing thought. I don't think I have any more particular things to talk about. If there are any questions, now's the moment to pose them. And if not, I guess I'll wind up with a song. Yeah, I think that's it for today. Another stumbling, stuttering live broadcast from Hope for Liminal Radio. It's Jason Horsley, who's also at horticulture.com. I encourage people to share this station if you enjoyed it. Let people know. I also encourage you to hunt down and watch Hoffman. Give me your thoughts on it. And all the other stuff too. Today there's a podcast with Dave O'Shana, part 2. I think it's one of the best I've done actually, and I have to be careful about saying that because I do feel that quite often, but I think it's definitely the best one with Dave, and I'm very happy about it. I think it came out very well, so give your feedback about that. Also the books and things: Vice of Kings, Prisoner of Infinity, Seen and Not Seen, Dark Oasis, and Paper Tiger. All the books previous are the ones that I don't want to be trapped in some relative eternity when I die, or defined by even in the present, so you can forget about those. But the others, I think you might find something of value and meaning, so if you haven't, do check them out. And if you have already, if you could review them at Amazon or whatnot, that would be a way to support what I'm doing. If you'd like to donate, do that via PayPal. Jason with you at protonmail.com. And if you've got any suggestions or requests for the way that this radio show could unfold, I'm thinking of expanding it to Hope so that it could be a whole bunch of different stations, different people, and then my show, I would have another show that was for local people, and then I would still have this one, but then it would just be one show on a station that was much more community oriented. So that's a possible development that would happen that wouldn't necessarily affect the style or content of this particular broadcast. But as far as that goes, as I say, it's always unknown to me, and I'm very open to any kinds of suggestions or requests or comments or criticisms. So if you want to share anything like that, of course you can't comment here, but you can comment at a podcast, or you can just send me an email. Once again, Jason with a U at protonmail.com.